Okay, I guess that's my cue. Sorry for the delay, everybody, and good afternoon, and thank you for joining the webinar. My name is Mark Bollinger, and I'm a research scientist at Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory. Today I will be walking you through some key results from a new study released last week that focuses on the utility-scale solar market in the U.S. Before we get started, I have just a few procedural announcements, most of which are listed on this slide. First, you should all know that you will be placed in listen-only mode throughout the entire webinar, which means that any questions that you have should be typed into the chat box, which should be on the left side of your screen. My colleague, Samantha Weaver, who is a co-author of this report, will be monitoring the chat box while I'm presenting, and then once I'm finished, she will read aloud or perhaps paraphrase your questions, and then one or both of us will attempt to answer them. Finally, as you probably just heard, the webinar is being recorded, and it will eventually be posted on our YouTube page, which you can find at the link at the bottom of this slide. And that link will be repeated on the last slide as well. So with that, let me go ahead and launch in. Here on the right, you see a cover shot of the report, which is the first edition in what will be a new annual report series for us. And the overarching purpose of this new series is to analyze the rapidly increasing amount of operational data that's becoming available in the utility scale sector of the solar market. Now, the term utility scale is one of those descriptors that can mean different things to different people. So I just want to clarify that in this report, or at least in this first edition of the report, we've defined it to mean any ground-mounted project that is larger than 2 megawatts in capacity. So this includes the large photovoltaic or PV projects like you see here in the top photo of the cover, as well as concentrating solar power or CSP projects like the parabolic trough and power tower projects shown in the bottom two photos. It also, by the way, includes CPV or concentrated photovoltaics, even though none of those types of projects are pictured here on the cover. How do I advance my slide here? Why isn't that working? Here we go. Sorry about that. So here we see a high-level outline of what I'll be running through today. I'll start off by talking a bit about the current and potential size of the market, since that is what has really driven us to initiate this new report series. After that, I'll run through some key findings from the four main topical areas covered in the report, which include not just installed costs or prices, but also operating costs, capacity factors, and PPA prices. So here's just a little bit of info on the size of the market. And in this case, I'm using data pulled from the GTM SIA Market Insight reports. So the graph in the upper left shows annual PV installations, both historical and projected, broken out by sector. And what you see here is that utility scale PV made up 54% of the market in 2012, and that's up from just 5% back in 2008. Looking ahead, Looking ahead, utility scale is expected to maintain its market-leading position out through at least 2016. Now that's just for PV. The graph on the bottom right includes CSP as well, and in this case, it shows installed utility scale capacity on a cumulative rather than annual basis. And you can see here that it really wasn't until 2009 or 2010 that we started to see any significant increase in the amount of installed utility scale solar capacity. Since then, it's been growing quite rapidly, and looking ahead, this year the cumulative installed base could double, and then it could double again by 2015. And then ultimately, by the time the federal investment tax credit reverts back to 10% at the end of 2016, there could be more than 18 gigawatts of utility scale solar installed in the U.S. Compared to just over 3 gigawatts at the end of last year. So even though it is still a relatively young market, it definitely has been growing like a weed with relatively few signs of slowing, at least over the next few years. And that growth and promise really, along with the recent achievement or attainment of a critical mass of empirical data to analyze, is really what prompted us to jump in at this point. So turning to the data itself, here we see installed PV prices in dollars per watt over time expressed in both DC and AC terms. PV is most often thought of and described in DC terms simply because most solar modules are rated in DC capacity. But for several reasons, AC actually makes more sense for utility scale projects. So here we include installed prices both ways, just so people can kind of ease into it and make the transition from thinking in DC terms to AC terms. And then the rest of the report, or in this case the rest of the slide deck, is expressed exclusively in AC terms. So this will be the last place that you see any data expressed in DC terms. So you can see here that installed prices have fallen over time, which I'm guessing is not much of a surprise to anyone on the line. And although our sample does not include any projects built after 2012, there is anecdotal evidence that installed prices have continued to fall in 2013. For example, here at the bottom of the slide, you can see some data that's been pulled from a recent utility filing, which indicates installed prices of just over $2 per watt for projects to be built next year, compared to $2.29 per watt for projects being built this year and $4.15 per watt for projects built back in 2011. And that 415 number, by the way, is almost spot on with our capacity-weighted average installed price for projects built back in 2011. Here we see the same data as in the previous graph, but this time just in AC terms, and also now broken out by technology or module type. Probably the first thing you'll notice here is that the decline in installed price has really been driven by projects using crystalline silicon or CSI modules, while thin film pricing has held relatively steady over time. And if you compare the sample size of CSI and thin film projects here, you'll see that the number of CSI projects has really taken off as its price has converged with thin film. You can also see the projects using tracking systems are more expensive than fixed tilt projects, as you'd expect, but really not by all that much. And the fact that this gap is not larger than it is could be attributable to something that I'll talk a bit more about later, which is the increasing DC to AC capacity ratio of fixed tilt projects in particular. Finally, I just want to acknowledge that we've got quite a large spread of installed prices among the fixed tilt CSI projects in 2012. We did take a closer look at each of these high-priced outliers shown here, and what we found is that most of them are smaller projects. They're often interconnected on the customer side of the meter, which of course presents a different value proposition, and they're also sometimes installed on top of capped landfills, which represents a customized and presumably higher cost installation. For next year's edition of this report, we are considering raising the 2 megawatt threshold to maybe 5 or 10 megawatts, or perhaps even higher, and this in turn would end up excluding a number of these smaller high-cost outliers. Having that problem advancing again. Here we go. Maybe. Okay. So here we see, somewhat surprisingly, only limited scale economies, particularly once you move out beyond 5 to 10 megawatts. And one possible reason for this is that the basic building block for many of these projects is a 1 to 1.5 megawatt prefabricated power block, and probably the best example of that is SunPower's Oasis product. Now, if you think about it, these mostly or completely prepackaged power blocks have probably already captured many of the scale economies that are available to PV. So once you move beyond installing a handful or so of these power blocks, the incremental cost reduction does not seem to be all that great. And of course, as projects get larger, other potential costs, for example related to permitting and transmission, might also serve to offset any further economies of scale. Finally, we see here that several years ago there had been a pretty substantial difference in installed prices across regions, but that difference has shrunk considerably over the past few years as experience with utility scale PV has become more widespread across the country. Okay, let's turn now to operating costs. We knew going into this first edition of the report that some of the data would likely still be rather sparse, and it turns out that O&M cost data fall into this camp. Because we didn't have much real data to work with, we dug up some fairly detailed operating cost projections from credit rating agency research on 3 recent solar project bond offerings. And those projections are shown here in the top graph, expressed in dollars per kilowatt year. And then the limited historical data that we were able to collect are shown in the bottom graph. And if you take the time to dig into this, you'll see that the real data in the bottom graph, though admittedly quite limited, do largely agree with the early years of the projections in the top graph. So in other words, we're looking at roughly $30 per kilowatt year O&M cost for PV and roughly $60 per kilowatt year for parabolic trough. We are, as you might imagine, hoping to expand our sample size in this area next year, so definitely stay tuned for what will hopefully be some more interesting analysis of O&M costs in future editions. Okay, turning to capacity factors, here you can see a pretty strong correlation, particularly among the fixed tilt projects, between each project's DC to AC capacity ratio and its capacity factor. So what's going on here is that some projects, perhaps encouraged by falling PV module prices, have oversized the solar array or the DC rating of the project relative to the available inverter capacity, which makes up the project's AC rating. And the reason to do this, or at least the end result of doing this, is to drive more DC power into the inverters during sort of the morning and evening hours when those inverters would otherwise be operating less efficiently at partial loads. And this, of course, has the effect of increasing capacity factor in AC terms. So, you definitely might think of this strategy almost like a surrogate or synthetic form of tracking in terms of what it does to the daily generation profile of the plant. It makes it much less peaky and instead much broader and flatter, much like you'd expect to see from an actual project that's using a tracking system. And this, by the way, is likely the reason that we didn't find much of a difference in AC installed costs between fixed tilt and tracking projects, as I mentioned earlier. Okay, sticking with capacity factors, the top graph here breaks them out by region, by fixed tilt versus tracking, and by module type. And the results are largely as you'd expect to see. The highest capacity factors are in the west region. Single axis tracking boosts capacity factors by roughly 20% on average, thereby validating that industry rule of thumb. And thin film seems to beat CSI in the west, where ambient temperatures are highest, but not elsewhere. And again, that's also what you'd expect. The bottom graph here focuses on CSP capacity factors over time and is comprised mostly of the SEGS projects from the 1980s, along with Nevada Solar 1, built in 2007, and then also eSolar's Sierra Sun Tower project, built back in 2009. You can see three groupings here in this bottom graph. Among the top grouping, the SEGS 3 through 9 capacity factors have converged in recent years, following upgrades to the two lowest performing plants. In the middle grouping, SEGS 1 and 2 have also been upgraded in recent years, but have lower capacity factors than their cohorts in general, simply because their collector field is significantly smaller. And then finally, down at the bottom is eSolar's pilot power tower project, which has seemingly not lived up to initial performance expectations. Okay, turning to PPA prices, here you see two almost identical bubble graphs of levelized PPA prices from nearly 4.3 gigawatts of utility-scale solar projects, roughly 60% of which are either fully or partially operational at present, and that's the distinction that the lower graph shows. These PPA prices are levelized over the full term of each contract after accounting for any escalation rates or time of delivery factors. And I should note that the size of each bubble corresponds to the amount of capacity conveyed through each of the contracts. So what you see here is a pretty strong downward trend in levelized PPA prices since 2007. Notably, the small to mid-sized projects do not appear to be any less competitive than their much larger counterparts. And although the CPV and CSP sample is quite small and is also by now a bit dated, at the time those few contracts were signed, they were still largely competitive with PV. And unfortunately, we don't have any more recent visibility into that comparison, which is perhaps telling in and of itself. Okay, sticking with PPA prices, here in the top graph we see that within each PPA vintage, which is represented here by the different lines, average PPA prices actually decline over time in real dollar terms. And this is simply because most of these PPAs do not escalate in nominal dollars, while those that do escalate typically do so at a rate that is merely intended to keep pace with inflation. And this visual representation of declining prices over time is perhaps a good example or a good illustration of the long-term hedge value that solar can provide. The bottom graph simply levelizes each of the individual lines from the top graph in order to provide a clearer picture of the downward price trend across vintages, and you can see that that downward trend has been remarkably steady at roughly $25 per megawatt hour per year. Now, one thing we've tried to do in this report is to not just focus on solar in isolation, but to also, where appropriate, to bring in useful comparisons to wind power as a way to illustrate solar's competitive position within the broader utility-scale renewable energy market. So up top here you see a bubble graph comparing levelized PPA prices from both solar and wind projects located within 4 southwestern states: California, Nevada, Arizona, and New Mexico. It turns out that 96% of our solar PPA sample resides in just these 4 states, so we've limited the wind projects shown in this comparison to these same 4 states as well. But what I really want to focus on is the bottom graph. It averages all of the bubbles or the levelized PPA prices from the top graph by PPA execution year, and it also only extends back to 2008, which is when the solar sample really started to pick up. And what you see here in the bottom graph is that solar has really given wind a run for its money, particularly in 2012 and so far in 2013. Now, these graphs focus only on the Southwest, but this convergence is happening in other places as well. For example, recently the Public Service Company of Colorado announced that it wants to add 170 megawatts of new utility-scale solar to its portfolio based on economics alone and without considering the possibility of future carbon costs or the need to comply with a renewable energy standard. So this convergence does seem to be somewhat of a notable event in the West, and particularly so given the greater value that solar tends to provide to utilities, which is what I'll turn to now on my next and last slide. And this one might take a little bit of concentration, so I will walk you through this pretty gradually. So the graph on the left here represents a wind project, while the graph on the right shows a PV project. The shaded background of each graph shows the percentage of generation in each month that falls into one of Pacific Gas and Electric's 3 time-of-day periods, so either the super peak, the shoulder, or the nighttime period. And you can see that wind generation is pretty evenly distributed between all 3 periods, while PV generation falls only into the super peak and shoulder periods because, of course, PV does not generate during the night. The individual markers on each graph, and by that I mean the triangles, circles, and dashes, show PG&E's most recent time of delivery factors applied to a hypothetical base PPA price of $100 per megawatt hour. So you can see here that you're always penalized with a price below 100 for generating at night, and you're also slightly penalized for generating within the shoulder period except during the summer months. Meanwhile, you are always encouraged to generate during super peak hours, and particularly so during summer months when the multiplier goes way up. Finally, the solid lines that are labeled post-TOD revenue for both wind and PV simply represent the $100 per megawatt hour base PPA price as modified by the time of delivery factors given the underlying generation profile of each project. So in other words, these lines represent the revenue that each project would actually earn. And you can see that solar does pretty well here, particularly in the summer months, while wind tends to more or less hug the base price throughout the year. On average, over the course of a full year, solar's time of delivery advantage over wind comes to around $25 per megawatt hour. And if you instead compare PV to a constant 24/7 flat block of power, solar's advantage is a little bit less. It comes to around $20 per megawatt hour in that case. Now this is an example that focuses on PG&E, but the results are similar for other California utilities as well. Finally, it's also perhaps worth noting that this is perhaps a fleeting advantage that PV currently has. As solar penetration increases further, the net peak load, that is the peak load net of solar generation, will shift later and later into the afternoon and evening hours when the sun is not as strong, And as that happens, PV's midday peaking generation profile will presumably no longer be valued as much as it currently is. And this is where storage, or perhaps CSP with thermal storage, can potentially play more of a role in the future. So those are the main highlights from this year's report. Here is a link to where you can find the report itself, as well as this slide deck, and eventually also a recording of this webinar, which will also be available at the YouTube link shown here as well. We do appreciate the funding support of the U.S. Department of Energy's Sunshot Initiative, and we are looking forward to digging into what should be a lot more data in the second and third editions of this report. So with that, let me go ahead and turn it over to Samantha to get started with questions. Sam?
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me, Mark?
Yeah, I can.
Okay, great. So as Mark said, I'm Samantha Weaver, and I'll be sort of fielding the question and answers today. So feel free to type your questions into the chat box, and I will try to read them all off. So thanks again, Mark, for presenting. So we have quite a few questions here, but to start, I'm going to ask one that goes back to maybe the third or fourth slide. And the question is, why is AC a more relevant? Why is AC more relevant than DC when we're talking about utility scale solar?
Yeah, there are at least two reasons for that. First, virtually every other utility scale power source is described in AC terms, and that goes for CSP as well. So if you want to compare PV to other utility scale power generation options, you really got to do it in AC terms. The second reason would have to do with the increase in the DC to AC capacity ratio that I mentioned. It's no longer the case that a project's AC capacity is simply sort of a fallout of its DC capacity less some inverter losses. Instead, AC is much more of a design factor these days in terms of developers intentionally oversizing the array to try and optimize the power output of the project. So to sort of ignore that by looking at projects only in DC terms, if you do that, you're missing out on some pretty critical information.
Sure. Okay, thank you. All right, and then we have a question here about scale economies. And it is, do you think that similar economies can be gained by standardizing small-scale systems? So, your slide looked at large-scale systems. Can small-scale systems match utility-scale economics by aggregated purchasing or other techniques?
I would say that, let me start off by saying that that's not something that we've specifically looked into, but there definitely are scale economies. If you recall the slide, you could see that these scale economies were much larger at the small end of the size range. And again, the graph was looking at things going from, I think, 0 up to 100 megawatts. So once you start talking about smaller systems, and I guess one question is, what do you mean by smaller systems? But anything below a megawatt, if you're talking about like residential systems, if you're trying to drop their cost by bulk purchasing and things like that, I mean, there are ways you can do that, but it's going to be difficult to match the installed cost or price of these larger utility scale projects.
Okay. Okay, and then we have a question about oversizing the arrays. Does the practice of oversizing the DC array effectively cause a dumping of PV during some hours, where, for example, the panels are producing more than the inverters can handle?
Yeah, that's exactly what happens. The array ends up generating more DC power than the inverters are sized to handle. And I'm not a real technical person, but my understanding is that the way that the inverters deal with this is that they move the voltage of the array away from the most efficient point, and in doing so, they sort of limit the amount of incoming power that they're seeing. So you're not dumping excess power onto the grid at that point. It's just never getting converted from DC to AC.
Right. Okay. I'm also getting several questions about power purchase agreement prices.
Mm-hmm.
And one of them is about our data. And the question is, are the levelized PPA prices for electricity only, or are they inclusive of RECs and or capacity?
Yeah, so we made a conscious effort in collecting the data and organizing it to only include those contracts that convey all energy, capacity, and RECs through the PPA. So we're not looking at unbundled contracts or anything like that. So every data point that I showed you is all inclusive of electricity, capacity, and RECs.
Okay. And then a related question is, you said that time of delivery price adjustments are included in the PPA price data, which makes one wonder whether highlighting PV's time of delivery advantage relative to wind is essentially double counting a benefit that's already embedded in that PPA price.
Yeah, that's a good point. The time of delivery factors are definitely included in the levelized PPA prices that I showed you, but I guess the issue is that not all contracts use time of delivery pricing. I think only about 50% or so of our sample is being sold through PPAs that use TOD pricing. So, for that 50%, it is a little bit redundant to then compare solar's time of day advantage to wind or to a flat block of power. But for the other 50% of the contracts, they presumably are not receiving any sort of explicit compensation for the time of day value that they provide. So in that instance, it is a little bit more appropriate to highlight that value separately.
Sure. Okay. And then one more PPA question is, how many years or how long are most of the PPAs you're seeing?
Yeah, so the term of these PPAs tend to be a little bit longer than you typically see for wind power. So for wind, we also collect quite a few PPAs for wind projects, and I believe the average term there is something like 20 years, whereas for solar it's more like 25 years. So these tend to be a little bit longer contracts, and I think that's probably because you've got an asset that basically has very few moving parts, and I think most people believe is going to have a longer lifetime than your typical wind turbine. And also, at least going back in time, these projects have been fairly expensive. So one way to try and lower the PPA price is to really stretch out the term of the contract.
Okay.
Just to add to that, I believe the maximum PPA term in our solar sample is 30 years.
Okay, great. We also got several questions about the comparison of wind and solar, particularly the sort of geographical regions that we chose. And sort of the best way I can paraphrase them is, why not compare wind and solar based on relative resources, not necessarily geography?
Yeah, no, that's definitely a good point. Yeah, I mean, wind in the central part of the U.S. is much more economical than it is in the Southwest, which is the region that I showed here. The issue is, I guess, for utilities in the West, in a sense, they're sort of stuck looking at the resources that are in their general area. I mean, there are some opportunities to import power, but for the most part, California utilities are looking at Nevada, Arizona, possibly New Mexico, and then maybe the Pacific Northwest as well. So it's definitely a good point that it might be more accurate to compare wind and solar based on the relative strength of the resource of each. But most of our solar sample is in the Southwest, so it just seemed natural to limit the wind sample to those same 4 states for the purposes of making this comparison.
Right, that's a good point. And speaking of that, another question we had was sort of what are the policy drivers that make it so that so much of utility-scale solar is installed in those 4 southwestern states?
Yeah. Well, there are obviously strong RPS policies in California and a few other states. The resource, I think, is just a huge factor. I mean, if you're going to do utility-scale solar, I mean, the Southwest is a great place to do it. New Mexico has a pretty aggressive refundable production tax credit that provides quite a bit of value to a solar project. And then, of course, the federal ITC. And that's not specific to the Southwest, but that's another big incentive for solar.
Okay. Let's see here. I'm looking for. Here's sort of a broader question. What additional areas do you want to research, and which areas do you wish you had more data on?
I think operating costs, O&M costs. That's always an area that's hard to find good data on, not just for solar, but also for wind. And I think in this year's report, it was the most limiting portion of our data. I mean, we only had a few projects for which we were able to gather O&M cost data. So going forward, that's what I'm hoping that we're able to pull in much more of next year.
Okay. And do you have a sense, speaking of O&M data, do you have a sense of what is sort of the greatest O&M expense for solar?
I've not really disaggregated it on that level, so I'm probably not going to have a good answer there.
Sure.
Inverter replacement is one thing that you often hear about. That's more of a lumpy thing that might happen, in year 12 or something like that. With tracking systems, there's probably some O&M related to maintaining the tracking portion and making sure that it's functioning properly. And then, at some point, the panels need to be cleaned as well every so often.
Sure. And could you speak at all to how O&M of wind compares to solar?
Sure. Wind O&M costs tend to be a little bit higher. So I think for PV, I think I mentioned roughly $30 per kilowatt per year seems to be what we're seeing. For wind, I would say that it's probably more like $50 per kilowatt a year. And let me just clarify that when I say that, I'm referring basically to total operating expenses. Actual O&M costs at the plant tend to be lower than that, maybe 50 to 60% of total operating expenses. But again, this is an area where we don't have a whole lot of hard data to look at, unfortunately.
Right. Okay, thank you. Let's see, we've got a question about PV panel quality. It says concerns were raised earlier in the year regarding PV panel quality. Do you think that those concerns are pertinent to your sample? And if so, where might their impacts be realized? Is it in O&M costs or elsewhere?
Okay. It's hard to know if they'll be pertinent to our sample. They very well could be. Most of these projects are still quite young, so I would imagine that if there is serial defects in some of the panels, that most of these projects will still be under a sufficiently rigorous warranty that those will be taken care of through normal warranty procedures. But if that's not the case, then yes, this would probably show up in O&M costs.
Okay. Okay, and here's another one. This has to do with capacity factors, and it's why don't newer PV projects seem to have higher capacity factors? Yeah,
so this question probably or potentially refers to the amount of space we spent in the report sort of looking at whether or not there was a time trend in capacity factors, and we didn't find one, and we really didn't expect to find one because as PV modules get more efficient, really what that means is that they become more efficient at converting the solar energy into DC power. So it's sort of like one step removed from the whole AC side of the equation. And what that means in practice is that as panels become more efficient, developers simply install fewer of them to reach a certain amount of capacity, or alternatively, they may install the same number of them in a given space, and that will in turn increase the size of the project. Either way, you're talking about lower costs on a dollar per watt basis. So unlike with wind power, where as turbines become more efficient, their capacity factor increases. With PV, it's more the case that efficiency increases lead to lower costs rather than higher capacity factors. And I think that's the reason that we really have not seen much of a time trend in PV capacity factors.
Okay. Okay, thanks. Let's see, we've got another good one. You would expect that installing tracking would either be economic or uneconomic in most cases, but your data show a lot of projects using tracking and a lot not using it. What do you know about that decision process and the key variables involved?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. I think one possible distinction is a lot of these utility scale projects use thin film or cadmium telluride modules, and historically at least thin film projects have not deployed tracking nearly as much as CSI projects. So there it's sort of a trade-off between if you want the thin film projects which operate better at higher temperatures, which describe many of the locations where these projects are built, then perhaps it does not make sense to deploy tracking in conjunction with those projects. Whereas if you're going with a CSI project, then maybe that makes a little bit more sense. The other issue here is that again, as module prices continue to fall, we're seeing more of this oversizing of the PV array happening, and that is sort of a surrogate form of tracking. So it could be that some developers have opted to go that route rather than installing a tracker and taking on the potential O&M burden down the road if that tracking system would potentially fail.
Okay. And maybe in a related question is, why do you think there are so few thin film tracking systems in the data set, in our data set?
Oh yeah, I guess I should have gotten to that in the last question. There are so few in our data set because there really aren't that many out there. I believe we have maybe one or two in our data set, and there are really, I think, two factors at play there. First is that because thin film modules tend to be less efficient than CSI, they take up more land area for the same amount of capacity, and once you add tracking to the equation, then your required amount of land area increases even further because you need to space the panels a little bit farther apart in order to avoid shading. So that sort of makes it, that sort of tilts the balance of the equation sort of away from tracking for thin film. A second factor might be the fact that these thin film projects tend to perform a little bit better in diffuse light conditions. So it's not quite as critical that they are, always perpendicular to the sun at any given time.
Okay. Let's see. So I think we have time for about one more question, and it's going to be, so how important are state incentives and the federal ITC, and what role do those play in PPA pricing?
Okay. Well, our sort of base assumption, and I think we see that borne out through modeling exercises, is that incentives are, for the most part, used to reduce PPA prices, at least in most states, in most competitive markets. So the more incentives that are provided, the lower the PPA price can be. So obviously the federal ITC is a big incentive for solar. It's at 30% of installed costs, and what that works out to in terms of impact on PPA prices really depends on who the sponsor is and how much tax appetite they have and how the project is financed. But I would say that it probably ranges anywhere from maybe $15 to $30 per megawatt hour of impact. So that's a fairly substantial PPA price impact. And then in terms of state incentives, there really aren't that many states that provide explicit financial incentives to utility-scale solar projects. Much more of the state incentive budget is targeted more at smaller-scale solar. There are some exceptions. I mentioned earlier that New Mexico has a 10-year refundable production tax credit that I believe provides roughly $27 per megawatt hour of after-tax value on average over that full 10-year period. So there are some states that do provide pretty lucrative incentives, but for the most part, it's the federal ITC that's the real main incentive.
Okay, that sounds good. I do have one more question here about CSP, and we do have a little bit more time left than I thought. So I apologize that I said last question. The previous question was the last question. But I felt like we should devote a little bit of time to CSP. And the question is, sort of what does our analysis tell us about CSP's future, at least in terms of PPA prices? And why do you think we've seen so few of them?
Yeah, so as I mentioned on one of the PPA slides, the very few CSP contracts that are in our sample did appear to be competitive back when their PPA prices were signed, but we haven't seen any new CSP PPAs being signed in the past few years, or at least not that have made their way into our sample. And one factor there is obviously the very large decline in PV module prices that we've seen over this period. So it's become much harder for CSP to compete on the basis of price alone. I will say that CSP likely provides higher value to a utility, particularly if you incorporate storage, thermal storage, into the project. One issue with PV, as I mentioned, is you're going to end up shifting the net peak load later and later in the day as the penetration of PV keeps increasing. With solar thermal or CSP with thermal storage, you don't necessarily have that issue because you can divert some of your generation into storage and then call on that later in the evening to meet the peak load at that time. So I think maybe one of the things that's been holding CSP back a little bit is that there's not a whole lot of value being placed on storage as of yet in the system, and I suspect that's something that's going to change in the next 5 or 10 years. We also, we haven't really seen that many new CSP projects built in the last few years, at least that are operating yet. Now we do have quite a few of them in the pipeline right now that will be coming online in the next few months. So hopefully we'll see some good operating performance out of those over the next year, and we can report on it in next year's report.
Okay. All right, I think that's it. Thanks very much, Mark.
Okay, thank you everybody for joining the webinar, and again, it will be recorded if you want to refer to it later, and if you have any questions, feel free to email either myself or Samantha. Thank you all, and have a good afternoon.
Thank you. Please stand by.